All right, welcome everyone to this week's edition of Military Trailblazer Office Hours. Thanks so much for taking time out of your Wednesday evening to spend it here in the spirit of community, mentorship, and learning. I'm your host, Dave Nava. I'm a lead solution engineer at Salesforce and a military trailblazer. Each week, we invite a co-host or co-hosts to take part in the conversation so we can leverage their experience, their expertise, and their unique perspectives. The focus for tonight's session is exploring the Salesforce Architect career path and technical architect role. And so what I'd like to do now is welcome and briefly introduce our co-host for tonight's session, Phuong Tran. Phuong is a senior enterprise architect with over 27 years of experience in the IT industry. He's currently a senior director of professional delivery services at Salesforce, which has been his professional home for the past 7 years. Prior to his tenure at Salesforce, Phuong worked at Accenture for over 15 years as a technical architect. Before Accenture, he spent 6 years serving in the Air Force as a communications and computers officer. And that is his story. So it's great to have you coasting office hours with me. Phuong, welcome.
Hey, it's great to be here, David. Thanks for the opportunity to speak with all these great folks. I'm excited.
Yeah, it's gonna be fun. So I know I went over your work history briefly, but do you want to take a moment and kind of introduce yourself further and share some more of your Salesforce background and story?
Yeah, sure. I mean, as David mentioned, I've been blessed to be here at Salesforce for the last 7+ years. I kind of grew up in Salesforce from what they call the program architect or advisory architect kind of role, where at least from a Salesforce architect perspective, we work with a lot of our strategic clients to make sure that they're making the most use of their Salesforce platform. Right? So just overall from a platform perspective, are they architecting in the right way? So I work with a lot of our clients, and then I also work with a lot of our delivery partners, like the Deloitte and Accentures of the world, as they're working with our clients to make sure that we're bringing sort of the best to offer from a Salesforce perspective. So it's interesting because before I took on this role from a Salesforce perspective, I was sort of on the other side from a technical consulting perspective with one of our partners with Accenture, and it's interesting to kind of like try to kind of walk both roles from the standpoint of like my experience in the past with Accenture and now being part of the mothership with Salesforce. So it's definitely an interesting perspective.
Yeah, that would be really cool to have both the partner perspective and use that to inform where you're at now with Salesforce. I have not quite as much experience, but I spent a year as a partner solution architect, implementing Salesforce solutions, and I found that really did influence my ability to support the customer during my time at Salesforce when I was working in implementation. So it definitely helped out to have that perspective. So I'm sure we'll dig into that during our session. For those joining for the first time, I always do like to briefly explain the purpose of these office hours before we open the floor for questions and general discussion. And so if you're new, welcome. These office hours are an informal get-together for gathering with military trailblazers as well as allies. Everyone's welcome to explore non-technical Salesforce career and branding-related topics to help you achieve your professional development and career-related goals. And so for the next hour, this is your opportunity for collaborative mentorship. Everyone on the call is encouraged to step up and either ask and help to answer questions from your perspective, which of course provides additional diversity of experience to the answers given. So throughout tonight's session, please do keep an eye on the chat window. I've already started posting links in there, including Phuong's LinkedIn profile link if you want to connect with him. And I'll continue to do that for the rest of the session. Things like employment opportunities, volunteer opportunities, knowledge articles, things of that nature. So this is your session. If you want to ask a question at any point during the session, please feel free to do so. You can either raise your hand and I'll call on you, or if you don't feel comfortable speaking up, no worries there. You can also post your questions in chat and I will get to those in the order that I see them pop up. So with that in mind, as I mentioned, the focus for tonight's session is both to talk about architecture in general and what the various roles are, but also specifically to focus on the technical architect role and dive into those responsibilities. And so to open the floor, Phuong, could you explain for the folks on the call what a technical architect is and what responsibilities that entails? I guess to give it context, right? Last week we had Abby Beatty on the call, who is, she's an architect. She is a business architect. We've had Adam speak before, program architect. So lots of different folks that have talked about the different areas of architecture. And this is a new area for us, technical architecture. So if you could just chat about what that's all about, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question because, I mean, frankly, the word architect can be somewhat of a buzzword and somewhat of it's somewhat confusing and somewhat, sometimes it's a little bit overused. But my perspective is it's sort of a continuum from an overall kind of business and technology perspective. I think on one side, you have sort of that enterprise architect that kind of looks at the overall architecture from an overall enterprise perspective, right? I mean, if you're at JP Morgan or USAA or something like that, there's enterprise architects that kind of look at the overall kind of business as well as technical architecture across USAA, and it's like grand self. But like from a solution architect perspective, you're more in maybe more of a specific domain area, kind of taking a look at specific business requirements and talking with the enterprise architects, and then seeing from a business requirements perspective, how do you what's the best solution, or what are the best solutions that can kind of fit these business requirements. And so the solution architect like Abby from last week, it sort of like has to traverse both areas, specifically from a business requirements perspective as well as a technology perspective. Most of the technical architects, that's where once we kind of understand sort of the business, where the company is heading from a strategy perspective, what are all the other kind of any dependencies across the enterprise. That's where the technical architect has to then, given that, how do we architect this system? Let's say from the context of Salesforce, how do we architect Salesforce in a way that meets these business requirements, right? Meets all the things around these, right? And so usually from a technical architect perspective, you're thinking how do we implement single sign-on across the enterprise, right? What's the type, what's the best integration pattern that we need to configure or develop within Salesforce to make sure that it kind of meets the business requirements, right? And so from a technical architect perspective, you kind of have to talk with all of the enterprise architects and the business architects, but your main emphasis is to really understand the requirement, understand the business, but then at the end of the day, you gotta design how it's actually going to be implemented, and work with the developers to actually get Salesforce set up. So that's how I would kind of frame it in terms of sort of that architect kind of continuum. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, and I appreciate you clarifying that, because obviously there's lots of different architecture paths out there, and you all work together performing cooperative but different roles. So to be able to break that down is helpful. And apologies, I threw your slide up there. Probably should have pulled it up earlier. Let me know if you want to go to a different slide in that presentation, and we can cycle through those.
I think this slide kind of talks through when we look at Salesforce and the role that consultants or professional services play within Salesforce versus back then when I was at Accenture, it has to be a little bit different, right? And how I would typically phrase it is, when I was at Accenture, whether it be a technical consultant or a technical architect with Accenture, I was a consultant working within a professional services organization like Accenture, right? At Salesforce, it's totally different from being a professional services consultant within a product company, right? And I'll say it again. It's totally different being a consultant within a professional services company versus being a consultant within a professional services company within a product company. And so I think from Salesforce's perspective, we have to kind of balance, right, between all the great things that our partners are doing and like the tons of innovations that our partners bring to bear, and just the scale of the Accentures and the IBMs and all that stuff. But from a Salesforce perspective, our perspective is that we also play a role from a professional services perspective, right? And I think, like, if you go to slide 6, in the sort of continuum of professional services, you have the customer, right? And the customer has their responsibilities in terms of, hey, I know my business, I have to work with my teams, I know my domain, and sometimes I have to be involved with change management and training. But you have the partners like the Deloittes or the Accentures that bring to bear like the large scale of delivery across all these clients, right? But from a Salesforce perspective, we also have to play a role in this picture too, right? Because as a professional services and an architect within Salesforce, I'm mainly sort of like the front end to a lot of our product teams, right? And so that's some of the value that I bring is around if, let's say, as we're implementing Sales Cloud or Service Cloud or something like that, there are certain limitations or within the product. It's one of my responsibilities is to make sure that I'm working with the product to either find what's the best implementation or what's the best, or is it in the roadmap, right? And so that's I think at the end of the day, like from a Salesforce perspective, we have to kind of have those kind of 3 players for the customer to be successful.
Yeah, I appreciate that distinction between what it means to work in professional services, from a partner versus from the actual product company that is in charge of the partner ecosystem, so to speak. We had I've got a quick question, but before I get to my question, there's a request to go back to the earlier slide, different architect roles, and so
typically what we want to do, and there's within Salesforce there's also like different nuances of being an architect, right? You can either you could either be in an advisory role, right, or you could be in a delivery role, right? So what that means is like delivery role. I mean, it's sort of like in my old Accenture days where there's a client and there's a statement of work, and I need to stand up Sales Cloud, and I need integration to Plan and MDM and things like that. I need X, Y, and Z, right? I need and this is in the statement of work. And so, from a delivery perspective, that's one role. The other role that's kind of interesting, that's why I love my transition to Salesforce, is that you could also be an advisory architect, right? What that means is that you're working with the client, and you don't start out with, hey, client, like client wants to do X, Y, and Z. You talk with the client. You say like, okay, client, like what are the things that you need to work on, right? And then I kind of take a look at their current situation, and then I kind of determine, these, in addition to, the problems that you're having with the org in terms of, data model or large data volume, I also see that you have adoption issues, and you also have issues around your overall strategy, around how you're integrating with all these different environments and things like that, or even your environment strategy. I mean, from an environment and DevOps perspective, you need to kind of work on those areas to make sure that you're making the most use out of the platform, right? And so that's sort of the beauty of the advisory architect kind of role, is that you kind of work with the client a little bit to kind of not only understand that, hey, this is kind of my pain points already, but it's also you as that experienced trusted advisor to say, hey, in addition to this, we need to also work on this with you. And so in like those kind of engagements, it's pretty nice because like you kind of work with the client to kind of determine, sort of like the type of engagement you want to have. And typically it's these kind of like kind of pyramids. It's either from a overall governance perspective, we need to make sure that we have the right COE in place from a Salesforce COE perspective. From a overall application design perspective, are there applications that we need to put into the Force.com platform? Like I said, do you have the right integration design? Do you have the right master data strategy? Do you have SSO set up correctly? DevOps and things like that. And so that's sort of what this is showing in terms of just the myriad of things that I work with clients on. It's the great thing is like great and bad thing is like every client's a little bit different. So you kind of have to kind of work with the client to see what they need.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. That's definitely helpful. We've got a couple of questions in chat that I wanted to get to. So one of the questions was, can these slides be available to folks on the call? So I'm happy to post these to my YouTube channel, Phuong, if you're okay with that.
Yep, I'm fine.
Okay, cool. So that's what I'll do, folks. I will I'll download these into a file, and then I'll post those to the YouTube channel. So they'll be in the description section with the attached files, together with all the links that we post in chat. And then Elio, I do see your hand. I wanted to get to one question that's in chat, and then we'll go ahead and get your comment as well. And so Rhonda asks, what are the prerequisites for applying for Architect Salesforce certs? Does it depend on your experience working with Salesforce? So I guess I would expand upon that, Phuong, to say, if someone desires to be a technical architect, what's the path for getting there? Because obviously, you've been doing this for 27 years. Someone just doesn't pop into the ecosystem and they're a technical architect and they're running projects and running a dev team. So what's the progression to get there, both from a experience perspective and, to Veranda's point, from a certification perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it kind of speaks to sort of like career path in general, right? Like you said, David, I mean, you can't just kind of wake up and I'm in this career field and okay, well, I'll be a technical architect for Salesforce, right? And so typically what I see is from years in industry, I mean, I would say 10 to 15ish kind of year. I mean, that's kind of guidelines per se, but like it's folks that have typically have done some type of development, or even from an admin perspective, you've not only done admin, but you've done more advanced types of things, or from being able to like go from one to another. Maybe you haven't been doing this on the Salesforce platform. You've been doing it in Java, or you've been doing it in AWS, some type of cloud infrastructure. Those are fairly transferable too, right? I think at the end of the day, architecture are sort of those sort of abilities, right? Scalability, portability. At the end of the day, there's various kind of abilities within from an architecture perspective. And so, experience does help in terms of whether it be on the Salesforce side or just on other kind of technologies. The other thing I'd say is from a certification perspective, in addition to experience, there is an architect trail in terms of, at the end of the day, like the sort of like certification nirvana for Salesforce Architect is the CTA, right? The Certified Technical Architect. And so, it's those two areas in terms of system architect and application architect and all the various certifications associated with that. in terms of, whether it be identity management, integration, things, even developer and things like that. And so it's called the architecture track. So I think if you go to certifications, you should see that track also. So.
Yeah, thank you, Phuong. I know Elio posted some helpful content there in chat, and Elio, I wanted to go to you next because you had your hand raised.
You covered it. Thanks. Sorry for that. I didn't want to confuse. It was posting some of that reference to support Phuong's comments, which I think are great for context and for folks that want to read more into the role. Exactly to what Phuong covered. There are different elements to becoming an architect, and that document covers just what Phuong so eloquently put it. Right? There's different aspects to being an architect. It's not just the technical or blah blah blah. And that reference link, folks, if you look on the chat, I posted it for that specific reason, so people are aware that they're looking for a more rounded individual that has different types of skills, not just one set of skills.
Right, and that's a great point, Elio. Where it's like, even if I look back 7 years ago when I joined Salesforce as a program architect, I had been involved with some like Salesforce implementations and things like that, but I wouldn't have considered myself a Salesforce architect. But I've been a technical architect for like 15 years. I think that's why they wanted me to become a Salesforce program architect, because one of the things that you want to do within Salesforce as an architect is sort of be that trusted advisor. And so, given that I wasn't, like, I would say, jaded or biased with doing Salesforce all my life, I could understand that, okay, if Salesforce isn't like the greatest with everything, right? If you're gonna do ERP, you probably aren't gonna fix Salesforce until next year, maybe when Salesforce comes out with the ERP cloud. But anyway, but like, yeah, I mean, from what I was trying to say is like, a lot of your experiences, and it may not be just on the technical side, a lot of your experiences matter, right? And so my experiences at Accenture, in terms of all the different things that I did there, pretty much kind of opened the door for me with Salesforce, because they saw that and they said, oh, like, I know that you may not have that, 5-10 years of Salesforce experience, but we know that you have the architectural underpinnings to kind of pick it up and kind of translate that to Salesforce.
Awesome, thank you. There's a couple questions in chat, actually quite a few now, so we'll go through them in order. And so I know we talked about it. Actually, we'll do Carlos's question, then Vrenda's. And so Carlos is asking, he's not sure if it varies per customer, but is there typically a single architect advising the customer, or is it more of a collaboration form of advisory? And I'm guessing the answer is probably specific to the type of project, but it's a great question, Carlos.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it depends on the project or program, right? How big the project or program is, right? I mean, if it's a fairly small size project, I mean, I think it doesn't make sense to have like 5 architects and things like that. But in a lot of like the large transformation projects that I'm involved with, there's typically architects that kind of are responsible for certain domains within the entire program, whether it be maybe integration based or dev wise, or master data kind of things, or it could be like, hey, we have to do with territory management over here versus like master data management over here and things like that. And so there's different domains, and then there's also, you could have Salesforce architects that are working with the client, but then you could have like Deloitte architects working on the same program, right? And so that's why it's always good to kind of know your swim lanes, right? Because And that's why, that picture before in terms of that better together, that, at the end of the day, like, I'm working with the Deloitte architects, and we always, have a chat, and we say like, hey, at the end of the day, our number one goal is customer success, right? And as long as we have sort of that North Star, we're going to be okay, right? And so I think, as with anything, where you're going to a situation where there's some potential for contention, you got to make sure that all the parties kind of get together and make sure that they're kind of like grounded in some type of North Star. And really, like, if we think back to our military days, that's always been the case, right? I mean, you have to have the vision of the hill that you're gonna go up, right? And then, like, if everybody's don't know their swim lanes, it's gonna be a bad trek up that hill. So I think I won't talk about current politics, but
No, that's a good analogy. Yeah. We'll go ahead and head down kind of down the list of the questions. And so I know at the beginning you talked a little bit about differences between a tech architect and a solution architect. Veronda is asking if you could expand upon that a little bit and just talk, I guess, day to day, what are the major responsibility differences from technical architect to solution architect? Because I think, in a lot of folks' mind, I think the roles sound very similar. Both are technical, both are architects, customer facing.
Yeah, and part of me, like, sometimes there's like specific definitions for them, and I could like go to Google and kind of like spit out the definition, right? In terms of, okay, like, from a solution architect perspective, you're kind of more looking at the business requirements and trying to see holistically from a solution set perspective, what are the main kind of solution sets that kind of fit that within the time frame and within the strategy of the overall client, as well as within the constraints of what they want to do with the overall enterprise architecture, right? For example, a lot of our clients, one of their enterprise architecture principles is cloud first, right? And so if they say cloud first, then as an enterprise architect, a solution architect, say, okay, we want to implement CRM, right? So from a CRM perspective, as a solution architect within the company, you would say, okay, there are, Microsoft Dynamics, there's Salesforce, right? But, CRM doesn't act within itself, right? I mean, you got to have master data. You got to have some type of order fulfillment. You got to have some, marketing system. You got to have some website, right? And so as a solution architect, you say, okay, for this customer 360 that I'm trying to build for this company, these are the requirements for customer 360. In order to do that, I know that I'm going to need to plug in, the .com. I need to plug in, Eloqua. I need to plug in, SAP and things like that, right? But then you also know that you got to know the timelines and resources and things like that. So usually that's what I typically see solution architects play in. When you talk about technical architect, okay, we have this, in order to have a customer 360, from a business requirements perspective with my technical architect hat on, I know I need to integrate with the .com, right? And so from a .com perspective, I'm going to get tons of stuff coming in from .com. How do I properly get all those signals from .com to Salesforce, right, without hitting governor limits or something like that, right? So as a technical architect, you have to say, okay, the business requirement is making sure that I have all the signals coming in from .com. I then have to say, okay, from a processing perspective, maybe I'll send it to Kafka over here, and Kafka will then feed to platform events or something like that, or there's some type of platform or asynchronous pattern we need to build in, or some type of aggregation so that we can kind of probably consume that within Salesforce. And at the end of the day, with the sales or service people looking at at their screens, they're like, inundated with like hundreds of events. So hopefully that's sort of like, sort of a real world kind of delineation in terms of sort of the different roles. But after 27 years, people ask me, who am I? Like, am I a solution architect, enterprise architect, or technical architect? I would say, like, I'm not a technical architect. I'm more like a technical athlete, where it's sort of like a decathlete, right? I mean, sure, you can throw the javelin or the 100-meter or the hurdles and all that stuff. But the decathlete, you kind of have to be a little bit good at all of it, right? And so when I go to a client, am I a technical architect? Yeah, but like, am I in there telling them how to do proper account management and proper opportunity management? Yeah. Am I telling them, like, hey, like, from a territory management perspective, I haven't seen clients do what you're doing? Yes, I did do that. Do I look at the enterprise and I say, like, we are going cloud first, or from an overall integration perspective, we don't have a strategy around how we're integrating within our enterprise. Do I get into those conversations? Yes. And so I think, you won't get there overnight, but at the end of the day, sometimes these roles can be a little defining. At the end of the day, you're an architect, and you have to kind of understand the business, understand the technology, and so that's what I would say. So one, there's the delineation, but two, I think we all, as we grow in our careers, we all have to be a little bit good in both business and technology. Right.
The phrase that comes to mind is jack of all trades, master of none. And so you really have to have a lot of experience in the various different, I guess, the various different modes of thinking, modes of thought, roles that all kind of wrap up into being an architect. And so, from what you were saying, it sounds like a solution architect is concerned kind of with the what. So in solutioning for this particular customer project, what systems do I have to bring together in order to meet their business needs? And then the technical architect is more of the person that decides the how. So from a in the weeds technical perspective, here's how I map all those things together. Here's the architecture that makes sense given the constraints, restraints, limitations, limits.
Yeah. And what I would say, it's more of an emphasis, right? I mean, the solution architect has to have an emphasis on the business requirements. The technical architect has an emphasis on the technical requirements and implementation, but they both have to know a little bit of the other, right? You can't just be a solution architect and say, like, hey, like, I'm just going to go wall to wall with Salesforce and like, we're done, right? I mean, you can't do that, right? And so versus on the other side, you can't be an architect that says, I'm just going to build this integration pattern that, creates this batch and like, it's going to run like every hour, every 24 hours and stuff like that. But on the business side, they want it like on, when they click the button, right? And so they both have to know the other, but I would say it's more of an emphasis.
Okay, that's helpful. I appreciate it. So we'll head back into chat for a couple of questions. Chris is asking, when you become a Salesforce architect, do you see the amount of hours you work bleed into your personal and or family time? How do you manage your professional and personal life with more responsibilities? So great question about work-life balance.
Yeah, great question. And I think I want to say the consultant way of saying, but like it kind of depends. It depends on a couple of different dimensions. It always depends on the client. Depends on the situation within the client, right? I mean, are you early in the life cycle, or you have to go live like tomorrow and things like that? And so I think there's a little bit of situational pieces to that. But let's say long tail of it. I think there's a couple of things that I would say there. One is that we all have to control our guardrails. We all have to control, and it's tough. Like right now, like we're, a lot of us are working at home and stuff like that. And, the guardrails that, kind of blurred. But we have to kind of take it upon ourselves to have those guardrails, because my experience is that if you don't put up guardrails, nobody's going to ask you, right? You know, if you say like, I gotta leave at 5, or I gotta pick up my kid at 5, or you know, I have to take off. You know, last week I had to take off to worry about my daughter's engagement party and stuff like that. I had to put those guardrails up, right? Because if you don't put those guardrails, they're not going to happen. Does that always mean like the person on the other side is going to honor those guardrails or accept those guardrails? For the most part, in working with Salesforce, my experience is yes, or either almost always on the Salesforce side, they're going to say yes. The client, of course, there's always a little bit of negotiation, but I would say, you know, like, you know, speak where your guardrails are, and kind of negotiate on both sides. If for the most part, you know, my work-life balance has been wonderful. I would say, you know, given my Accenture career, there were a lot of, I mean, I love my Accenture career, and I still talk with a bunch of Accenture folks, and, you know, like I think two weeks ago, I spoke with my old career counselor, who's now the head of all of Salesforce consulting at Accenture. But you know, almost every project seems like a death march, right? I think some of us have been on those death marches where, you know, it hasn't been pretty, but, you know, you look back and it's like you enjoyed the experience, I guess. But from going through that to Salesforce, I think Salesforce has really kind of honored a lot of my work-life balance. And my wife had hip surgery, and I had to take off to make sure I took care of her, and the client honored that. So, I mean, that's what I would say, right? I mean, you gotta put your own boundaries, and you gotta try to protect those boundaries. If not, then nobody's gonna know. Nobody's gonna know, right? And so I think we all have to take responsibilities to put our own boundaries. Does that make sense?
Those are great points. And I would say, for me personally, I leverage my calendar. So, you know, whoever happens to be on your team, if you have a meeting, you know, 15-minute meeting with your team, and you explain kind of how your calendar is set up and how you've organized it, so that they understand it, you share it with them, so that there's an agreement. You know, if I have in my calendar focus time, for example, you know, where it says unavailable, then you know, what does that mean? If I have focus time where it says available, but please ask, what does that mean? So if you come up with these different categories of availability, you plug that into your calendar, and then you always leave some open spaces. I found that as a best practice for managing work-life balance. You're getting the time that you need. You're also making time for customers and for your internal colleagues. And there's no question about when you're available, when you're not available. Obviously, emergencies will come up, right? And you'll have to shift that sometimes, but that should be the exception rather than the rule. There's a couple more questions. We've got one from Jeremiah and one from Natalie. And so Jeremiah is asking, while aspiring to be a technical architect, is it required that one has sound knowledge of development? So do you have to be a developer to be a technical architect in Salesforce?
I would say, I guess I'm a little biased because I kind of grew up in development. I studied computer science. When I was in the Air Force, I was doing a lot of on the software side, even as a comm officer in the Air Force. And then during my Accenture days, the early parts was custom Java development and things like that. And so I would say development experience does help because a lot of the things that you deal from an architecture perspective, if you kind of don't have that at least the understanding of the things that you went through, or the trade-offs that you went through as you're going through the development, it's pretty difficult to. I'm not saying that it's impossible, but I'd say like it's probably easier for you to transfer, as you're going through a developer to the architect. That being said, have all the architects I've met like have been like full-blown developers. A lot of them have maybe developed for a year or developed for two, but maybe they went somewhere else, right? Or I might meet somebody who went through the admin ranks, but really kind of understood sort of the various, once you talk about integration, you understood, we talk about single sign-on. I mean, at the end of the day, like it's all about handshakes between different systems, right? And so I would say, yeah, I mean, developer kind of background does help, but I mean, there are instances where you can traverse without some being hardcore developer, I would say.
Yeah, in my experience, just to piggyback on that, the technical architects that I've worked on weren't necessarily, developing for that project. They didn't have their hands in the code, writing, refactoring. They were in charge of the developers who were. So even though they weren't actively writing, they still needed to have a sound knowledge of coding best practices. They had to be able to look at code, spot problems. And I think, you want to have that level of familiarity with whatever languages are central to the technical architect job you're going to be in. For Salesforce, it's Lightning Web Components and all the languages that compose that. Obviously, sometimes Visual Force, Apex, JavaScript. Otherwise, you can't lead your developers. Is that fair, Phuong?
Correct. Yeah, that's very fair, right? I mean, you gotta, I think it was the same when we were in the military, right? Like, I mean, the lead, you have to kind of know a little bit about what your troops are doing, right? So it's the same thing here.
Yeah, good point. Elio, we'll go ahead and take your question or comment, and then Natalie will jump to you.
Yeah, just a quick comment. As I've been in tech for 25 years, I'm not a developer, but I do know of software development lifecycle. And I think not necessarily needing to code, but understanding how you position an architect opinion and recommendation, right? At Salesforce, specifically in my current role, we try to get our clients to use the platform in a way that helps them meet their business goal. So there's a give and take that you need to be able to articulate, right? We have a lot of out-of-the-box functionality that a lot of our clients are not aware of. And I know the speed to value is a lot faster. Am I a coder? No. I have a lot of respect for developers, but the question about knowing the development life cycle is valuable in understanding what it would take. Hey, for developing a custom solution, you might look at the technical resources, the development life cycle of building the code, testing the code, doing qualification and acceptance. That's I think a good way of looking at it without necessarily saying, I have to learn how to code Java or Apex before I can become an architect. That's what I've seen in the field. So Phuong, I don't know what you think about that. It's just a different way of looking at it from an architect perspective. What is the give and take? Do people understand the development life cycle that it's going to take for you to build something, or are you going to lead the development of that product? So architects, at least some of the roles that I've seen, you will have architects that lead the development team and some architects that just design the solution based on business goals, not necessarily lead the development team.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I talked about in terms of that sort of continuum of an architect, right? Whether it be an enterprise architect perspective, solution architect, technical architect. I would say, like, in the realm of enterprise architecture and solution architecture, I think I agree with you. On the technical architecture side, most of what I've seen on the technical architecture side, the majority, I wouldn't say like, you can't do it, but like the majority has been some development background, or to your point, like some understanding, and then they like in order to like architect a DevOps solution, right? You don't have to know how to how to write this Apex code. So you need to know that, there's a piece of code and you have 5 developers working on it, and you got to have a proper branching strategy to make sure that people aren't hitting on each other, and that it's going to go to QA, and that it's going to go to production. But does that need developer experience? No. I mean, you can still architect that DevOps piece without it. And so I think, as with a lot of, at least on the technical architecture side, the developer kind of experience helps, but it doesn't mean like you have to be a developer for life or a developer for like 20 years or something like that. I think to Elio's point, like you need to have an understanding of all the different roles in a Scrum team and kind of how everybody plays, and especially with development lifecycle, you have to kind of understand the development lifecycle. Right? So.
Yeah, great points, and thanks for covering down on that question. So what we'll do here is just a quick reminder: if you did want to have some of the comments that are in the chat, you can copy those to like a Google document. And while we're on that topic, if you wanted to share your LinkedIn profile for the other folks on the call to expand your network, you can go ahead and post your profile whenever you'd like into the chat, and then feel free to connect with each other. We've got a couple more questions here in the chat, one from Natalie, one from Brenda. And so we'll take Natalie's first. And she's asking, as a BA/admin, I'm curious to know, what are the biggest pet peeves or pain points an architect has about team members and clients? For example, what makes your job harder or easier?
Oh, that's a great question. I think like one is always like there's always an assumption that everything's easy, right? We're just going to hook up like Eloqua and Salesforce, right? And then there's this connector, and like you just kind of hook it up, and it's fine. But then once you double click into some of those business requirements, it's like you finally know that, okay, this connector doesn't always work because it doesn't bring up the leads in the right amount of time, and so there's always a level of complexity that I think people don't recognize. The other piece is around like there's always like a process technology, business process technology side, right? There's always the hardest part that I've seen as a technologist all these years is like change management is hard, right? And so being able to like right the ship of like a big company like GM or Ford or something like that, it technically it could be doable, but like it's the people and process, right? I mean that's hard sometimes too, and so I think a lot of the times people don't kind of understand sort of like writing the Titanic is very difficult, even though you can put steer, you can pull the steering wheel. It's not gonna go that much. And then I think the other piece is I think those are probably my kind of two biggest pet peeves. Just it's easy and it's easy. Do it.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, it's good to always kind of, you can look at a job description, get a feel for what the responsibilities are and the requirements, but sessions like these where you can actually talk with someone in the role to really determine on a day-to-day, like, what's the job actually like? What annoys you about it? What do you love about it? What are the challenges? That's where the value is. So I appreciate you talking about that. Just a couple quick things to note from chat. So Verunda shared a jam file with the comments for the meeting, which is in the chat there, which is helpful. Thank you for that. And then let's see. Just scrolling through my chat here. Ashley is asking if anyone's completed the Pathfinder program. So if you want to respond to her in chat, she applied and wants to get some additional insight into that. And so while you're pondering that, we'll take Brenda's question. And so he's asking, being a Salesforce developer by profession, is there any specific path in terms of certifications to follow and gradually lead to the architect role? So how do you convert yourself from a developer to an architect? Like, what are some next steps you can take to begin to really dive into the different parts of the business and amass all the different experiences that you need to have to be that full up round to assume the architect role?
Yeah, great question. I think we answered a little bit, and I think Elio chimed in with like this is from a certification perspective. These are the path to CPA from the application architect and system architect perspective. The other thing I would say is like there's the certification piece, and there's also sometimes there's a holy war between, hey, this person is a developer versus this person is an architect. What I would say is that as as you grow through your career, from an architect perspective, you kind of have to pull yourself away from the weeds in terms of, hey, we've got to work on this class, and this class needs to talk to this class, and this is the best way to write this for loop and all that stuff, and you gotta like pull up to ask questions, right? You have to ask questions, and I think that goes through to my next point in terms of an architect just isn't about being a technical person, right? You have to have the soft skills to be able to communicate to your business partners, right? You have to have the soft skills to communicate to your, technical partners, right? And you have to be a leader, and that's I think that's what I love about my my Salesforce my military experiences. It's not about just knowing your craft, right? It's also about being able to communicate either to your troops or whether it be to to different folks, your colleagues. You got to communicate to your to the VPs. You got to have those soft skills to be able to articulate that. And then the third piece is around leadership, right? I mean, you got to step up and sort of take on that leader hat, because as an architect, you can't just say, hey, this is like, hey, like option A, we could do this. Option B, you can do this. Option C, you can do this. What do you think? No, like you got to be a leader. You got to say, these are the three options. But, from my perspective, option A, it's going to lead us in the wrong path. Option B is the optimal path. I mean that's from my professional opinion, that's where we should go. Right? So not only getting out of the weeds, but also taking a look at the big picture. But then you gotta like work on those soft skills. I've had to work through my soft skills throughout my career, and I continue to do that. And I continue to work through my leadership skills. I still try to continue to be a better leader, even where I'm at with my career. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, thank you, Phuong. And hopefully, Vanda, that helps with mapping out kind of some activities that you can take to best position yourself to work toward the architect role. I would also add, I've had great success regardless of the position that I'm interested in job shadowing. So if there's a role out there that I'm interested in, and someone's doing it at my company, just, ask to tag along and kind of take a look at what they're doing, some of the best practices that they're implementing, their habit patterns. And as you begin to emulate those, then obviously that will help prepare you for the role as well. So we've got about 4 minutes left, time for maybe one or two more questions. So if you've got a burning question, please go ahead and post it in chat. I did see the Pathfinder Program question, and I shared the link there, which is the Salesforce site link, and you can find out more there as well as apply. I wanted to ask a question. So, we talked about, Natalie, I think, asked, what are your pet peeves? And I'd like to flip the question to say, what's the absolute best part about being a technical architect? Like when you think about it and you're getting up in the morning, what gets you excited about jumping on a project or getting on a call with a customer? What is that for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I'll frame it within the standpoint of working at Salesforce and architect within Salesforce. What I would say is like, one, I, I've been in technology for long. I love technology. The other piece is, being Salesforce, like Salesforce, changing like every day, and like you have to continue to learn every day, even till today. And that's been exciting because it's never the same thing. It's not like database, every day kind of thing. It's always changing. It's Marketing Cloud, Commerce Cloud, Slack, who knows. So you always learn new things. But the other thing is like Salesforce, typically when you work Salesforce, it's always like one of the burning, platforms within a client, right? They want to build this digital enterprise, and like Salesforce is it. And so whenever I'm in a client, it's always within the context of like it's their number one program. It's their number one, like in my situation, we have like Brett Taylor talking, our CEO talking with the CEO of my current engagement, right? It's that type of like exposure, and like that's cool, right? It's like it's not like you're working on some back office stuff, and it's like, oh, we're just like integrating SAP with like, I don't know, like some EDI or something like that, right? I love SAP. But yeah, that's what I would say. Like it's just at the end of the day, like you just want to know that what you're doing matters, right? What you do makes a difference, and just just being able to like kind of experience that. I mean, and especially with the way Salesforce is and just the brand that it has. I don't know. It's been exciting, I would say.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. We have a couple minutes left, so I wanted to close with this question. And so, for the folks out there that may be considering, beginning the path toward architect, whether that's technical architect, program business architect, what were some of the, I guess, how did you approach choosing the area that you wanted to focus on? What are some considerations that you took into account before really diving down that path?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think maybe it's back to where I was talking about, right? In terms of making a difference in terms of what you're doing. If I had gone my kind of straight developer route, I mean, would I have been happy? Yeah, probably. But like, would have gone through my why in terms of making a difference, making sure that I have the biggest impact in an enterprise? Probably not, right? And so that's why I kind of went up that route so that I could kind of think big picture. But then also from an overall perspective, you get somewhat of career independence, right? Because now I was a technical architect, master of all trades at Accenture. Salesforce thought I would be a great Salesforce architect, and now I'm not saying I would go to AWS, but like can I go to AWS and like be an AWS architect? Sure, right? And so I think that's the other beauty of being an architect is you get some level of independence of the underlying technology, because those skills as an architect kind of are pervasive across various technology platforms is what I would say.
Awesome, thank you. Do you have time for one more question, Phuong?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, great. Yeah, we'll close it out with Ashley's question, and she's asking, is there growth beyond architect, or is this the height of that particular path?
Oh wow, I think there's always growth in any kind of career field. I think it just depends on what you're kind of interested in and what your passions are. Typically, if I look at myself or other folks in my career field, you could kind of continue to be sort of that individual contributor and just like work with clients to build the most beautiful architecture of X, Y, and Z, right? Or you can be a leader, right? You can be a leader of architects because you've done that. you know how to lead the architect, but then you're also interested in the business side of the house, right? You want to grow the business. You want to, you want to build the best architects, because, kind of where I'm at is, and that's the career path I've chosen, is that, there have been a lot of people that have raised me to where I am today here at Salesforce. And I want to pass it on to other folks, right? And so I kind of picked that route. So there's growth in that area as you progress through that rank, right? You from either from an individual contributor perspective, or as you grow up and be a leader of leaders and also a business leader, and then just in the day, like, I think the sky's the limit, right? I mean, there's with any role, right? The sky's the limit. It's just basically kind of what you're passionate about.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. We are at time, or a little bit over time, folks. So before we do close, I want to thank Phuong for spending some time with us tonight to talk about not only architecture in general from a career path perspective, but specifically the technical architect role. Very, very informative. So thank you, Phuong.
Oh, no problem. Thanks, anybody. And yeah, I'm on LinkedIn. I think as I talked about before, a lot of people have brought us up to where we're at today. And so yeah, hit me up on LinkedIn. I'll go ahead and reply. And if you want to set up a call, and we can chat further. My virtual door is open, so I'll give that as an invitation.
Awesome. That's a great resource. Thank you for offering that. And thank you as well to all of you for spending time on your Wednesday evening to come together in the spirit of community mentorship and learning. I appreciate that. I also appreciate all the questions and hands raised. Fantastic to get that dialogue, because really it's about you for these sessions, not so much me conducting an interview, but really you asking the questions that are burning within you to figure out, what your path's going to be, or how you're going to advance your career. So thank you for being active and for participating in the session. Join us next week. And in the meantime, please have a safe week, and I hope to see you all on Wednesday at the same time.